member of our center here for the study of war and society. We have to do the reminder to silence your cell phones, because, you know, you don't want to be that person. Yeah, see, it works every time. Everybody's always forgotten. And while you're doing that, just as a reminder, if you want to be on our email list to receive updates about when we're having these talks, when we're having our roundtable discussions at the public library, all that good stuff, make sure you sign up before you leave. And if you want some literature on the center, you can pick that up as well. Also, don't forget, next month for our monthly meeting at the public library, Hattiesburg Library, Jeff Bowersox is going to be leading our discussion with a book looking at Germany and the post-war experiences and how Germans responded to the end of the Second World War. And in May, I'll be leading our discussion on Lee the Last Years, which looks at Robert E. Lee in the years immediately following the American Civil War. And again, more information on that is available there. If you have any questions about the center or anything we do, please feel free to stop one of us, either myself, Dr. Wiest, Dr. Sturr is there too. Pretty much anybody in the department can answer some questions for you if you have any when we're done. And without further ado, I want to go ahead and introduce our speaker tonight. Andrew Wiest is the author of the forthcoming Boys of '66. Some of us have been lucky enough to read an early version of this, and it is absolutely outstanding. He's an acknowledged expert in the study of the Vietnam War and in the broader field of military history. Professor Wiest is the author or editor of 14 books, ranging from general studies of warfare to specific tactical histories. His most recent monograph, Vietnam's Forgotten Army, Heroism and Betrayal in the A. R. Arvin, New York University Press, 2008, won the Distinguished Book Award from the Society for Military History, the highest award in the field. Several of his recent works have been main selections of the History Book Club and the Military History Book Club. Dr. Wiest has appeared on several documentaries for the History Channel, Grenada Television, and as part of the Adventures of Young Indiana Jones documentary project, which is a documentary branch. That's the cool one. You got to go to Skywalker Ranch and everything. You got to mention that one. Dr. Wiest has made presentations on his research throughout the United States, as well as in the United Kingdom and Australia, and has written invited opinion pieces for several national media outlets, including the San Francisco Chronicle and CNN.com. Presently serving as the Charles W. Morman Distinguished Professor in the Humanities at the University of Southern Mississippi, where he also directs our Center for the Study of War and Society. Dr. Wiest has also taught at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst and at the United States Air Force Air War College. He'll be speaking tonight on Strange Defeat, America, Vietnam, and the Legacy of the Lost War. And hopefully he will be speaking better than I am tonight. He's so good at it. And he's a great guy.
We had the same amount of beer before we started, so.
Thanks, Andrew.
Wouldn't have it any other way. Thanks everybody for coming out on a what day is today? Tuesday. I forget it. I can't keep it straight. It's the day I teach, so. I never can keep it straight, and it feels like very much like I'm lecturing to my Vietnam class here. So if I stray too much into a direct lecture on Vietnam, I apologize. Thanks, Richard and Craig and everybody else for supporting the center. Thank the center for having me in. They're putting me up in my own bed tonight, which is a long drive from here. We have something great going on here, and I'm glad to kind of wrap up the end of the speaker series. I had to decide what to do tonight, because we're talking about defeat in warfare, and golly, Vietnam's kind of a natural place to go when you're looking for defeat, you would think. And, well, we'll get into that a lot more in a second or two. And I had to kind of think, golly, do I want to give the very boring, deep academic talk based on my new book, or should I do other stuff that's perhaps more likely to keep you awake? I chose the latter. I chose the latter stuff that was perhaps likely to keep you awake, and we'll see. Essentially, see if this thing works. And that says go forward, and it's not working. I use this guy, and that works. Yay! Essentially, I'm going to toot my own horn. Jill says I don't toot my own horn enough, so I'll toot my own horn. Essentially, the chat tonight will be based on the last three things I published on the, I forget which site, I didn't look at it. Amazon.com puts out cruddy pictures of your covers, by the way. On this side is Vietnam's Forgotten Army, a book about the South Vietnamese military and its relationship with the U.S. military during the entirety of the Vietnam War. In the middle is a book on historiography. It's a collection of responses to Martin Moyer's Triumph Forsaken. And thus, it's Triumph Revisited. It's a look at that. It's a historiographical look at the present situation of the Vietnam War. And on the right is a book that I co-edited with a couple of ex-students of mine, and some of our colleagues here put in chapters, including Dr. Austin, who's in the back, and Dr. Sturr, who's around here somewhere. I think you were the only two authors who were in the audience. But essentially, this is a book about all the stuff in the Vietnam War that I don't know a damn thing about, which is a lot. Because the Vietnam War impacted so many things other than Vietnam. It impacted the home front, it impacted music, it impacted the psyche of the soldiers who served there. And in approaching all these three different topics, I came across a lot of interesting questions about Vietnam, perhaps fewer interesting answers, which is inherently the problem, that there's more questions still existing about Vietnam than there are answers right now. With the theme being defeat, again, I thought I'd kind of look directly at that topic. Defeat, kind of based on all these recent things I've been working on. And to show you how difficult the Vietnam field of study is at present, nobody's even sure whether it's a defeat or not. And even if it is a defeat, what kind it is. So the history of Vietnam is wide open. This comes mainly from the Moyer book, the historiographical look at it. The historiograph, and that's a big word. That means what other people have said about history for the non-historians in the bunch. There's two main historiographical fields of study when it comes to Vietnam. There's the so-called Orthodox school of study, which is essentially equatable to the Doves during the Vietnam War. And as you might suspect, since we're only just now beginning to think about the 50th anniversary of some of the things to go with the Vietnam War, many of the players in setting up that aspect of Vietnam are still alive. They're still major players in the historiography of the war. So you have the Orthodox side, and on the other side you have the revisionist side, which is, and it's kind of backwards compared to many other historical fields, but the revisionist sides are generally equatable to the hawks in the war, the interventionists, and the guys who thought we should be fighting there, and perhaps fighting a little harder. Perhaps the most divisive question, and boy, I tell you what, when I first moved into this field from the study of World War I didn't know how divisive this was. These people fight, they yell at each other, they call each other names, literally. You can't get them in the same room together, much less on the same historical panel together. And perhaps the most divisive question they have that really separates them is, was Vietnam a defeat? I mean, they can't even decide on that, much less anything else. So let's look at this. The first basic question I kind of want to deal with tonight is, was Vietnam a defeat? Two pretty good pictures of it here. This is South Vietnamese trying to get on the last few helicopters from the American Embassy during Operation Frequent Wind in 1975, the very chaotic evacuation of Saigon. And on the bottom right is a street corner on Saigon just a few years ago. It was taken on one of our trips to Vietnam. And as you can see, I'll come back to that picture in a minute, but notice what's dominating the Saigon skyline there. It is a Coca-Cola advertisement, perhaps. But perhaps things aren't as simple as we think when we come to dealing with the Vietnam War. Let's look at the Orthodox view and their view of defeat. Unquestionable defeat. America was summarily defeated in Vietnam, catastrophically defeated in Vietnam, in a way that's going to reverberate through American culture for years and years, decades, all the way up to today. And not only were we defeated in Vietnam, we were predestined to defeat in Vietnam, because we shouldn't have been there. We were stupid. We backed the wrong Vietnamese in a very stupid way, instead of backing the right Vietnamese in a smart way, which would have been backing the communists, and on and on and on. It's the same view, historiographically speaking, that many of the players on the anti-war side would have said back then. And then there's the revisionist side to the were we defeated in Vietnam part. They say we were right to be there. The communists, Ho Chi Minh and people like that, golly, these guys weren't Titos of Southeast Asia. These guys were takeover prone of the entire region. They were dyed-in-the-wool communists who had that much higher than Vietnamese nationalism in their books. So perhaps we were right to be there, the revisionists say. But let's get to this idea of defeat as opposed to national motivation. The leading revisionist books, Mark Moyer's book, which Triumph Forsaken, which only gets through 1965, so I'm really waiting for his next book that actually fights the war. And it's books like that damn thick, so it's kind of, I can't wait for this thick book to be on the war itself. He contends, the reason it's called Triumph Forsaken is he contends we had that war, we, the Alliance, mainly the South Vietnamese, had that war won in 1963. the war was won. There was a triumph, but it was forsaken in the sense that America, in its dumbheadedness, took part in the assassination of Ngo Dinh Diem, the South Vietnamese president, and just everything went to hell in a handbasket after that. We forsook our defeat of the North Vietnamese, which he contends if you dig far enough in the North Vietnamese archives, you can actually find evidence for that defeat, something they're very much not willing to admit, as you might suspect. God, there's a lot to be said about Warriors Triumph Forsaken, or I wouldn't have written a damn book about it. But let's move on to the other main piece of revisionist thought, and that's Louis Sorley's book, A Better War, about the second half of the Vietnam War, the half commanded by General Creighton Abrams. His basic contention is, in 1968, we won the war. I think there's a little bit more evidence to prove this one. The Viet Cong got summarily pasted in the Tet Offensive. I don't think there's any doubt about that. I think an outside observer can pretty much understand that if 84,000 Viet Cong stand up and fight and 50-something thousand of them were killed, they had a pretty tough time in the Tet Offensive. His argument was that the counterinsurgency, the war against the Viet Cong, was won in the Tet Offensive, and that the war suddenly changed into something else, a very much more conventional war, a wholly different war, where it was South Vietnam against North Vietnam. Again, I think there's some legs to that, but what he says, what he goes on further to say, is that this victory that we won was squandered by especially lily-livered people in the Congress, who suddenly took America out of the war after victory had been essentially won. So there's huge arguments. We can't even decide whether Vietnam was a defeat for America or was actually a victory that was somehow snatched away by ineptness or possibly planning on the part of people that the military wasn't very happy with at this time. And I think there's some interesting circumstantial pieces of evidence taken from these pictures, actually the one on the right, that goes along with this line of reasoning. The line of reasoning contends, well, Vietnam was but one battle in the longer Cold War. It was like Dunkirk. You know, the British lost pretty badly in the Battle of France, but they pulled out and they were able to win World War II. So if you look at Vietnam like that, to where Vietnam is actually a war against the communists, well, the fall of the wall, the collapse of the Soviet Union indicates that the overall war was won. And a second one, and this is just again circumstantial, if you go to Vietnam today, what you find, and I've had veterans say this when I bring it back to Vietnam, they say, wow, Vietnam is about as communist as Gulfport. It's a town of small businesses, it's a town of big businesses, and now, this picture was taken a long time ago, the mopeds are being replaced by cars. I mean, Vietnam is very much, it's still a centrally, run dictatorship, but it's not a communist dictatorship in the economic sense anymore. So there are some circumstantial indicators that indicate that perhaps Vietnam wasn't the defeat, or a typical defeat. That's why I call it a strange defeat, if you get back to the beginning. Well, let's get down to it. Let's get down to this picture. Vietnam was a defeat, I'm going to tell you. So if y'all are in my class, y'all can answer this on damn fine. Vietnam was a defeat, period. Because our goal in Vietnam was a sustainable, independent South Vietnam. You don't have this with a sustainable, independent South Vietnam. Okay? It was, well, again, we'll get to the strange part of it in a second. Go ask the people living in New Orleans, living in Houston, living in Orange County, living in Falls Church, Virginia. Go ask the huge Vietnamese expatriate population whether this was a win or a loss. And they'll tell you it was a loss. They had to flee their country for the third time, well, for the second time, many of them. Many of them fled south in 1954, of course fled the fall of Saigon in 75. For them, it's a much more cut and dry thing. They don't have the luxury of sitting around and arguing whether Vietnam was a real defeat. They're separated from their families. They feel afraid to go back. To them, it was a defeat. And let's call it a defeat. Even if it wasn't this, even if it wasn't my favorite movie, Red Dawn, with communists conquering your McDonald's and Patrick Swayze and the Wolverines having to rise up and defeat the horrible Cubans that come to take us over. So it's not that defeat. Washington wasn't burned down. America wasn't occupied. But I do think it was certainly a defeat to our goals in Vietnam. Okay, so America, world's biggest superpower. Let's get this out of the way. Defeated by a third world nation. Now we get to the other questions of why the strange defeat is. Why? Who can we blame this on? And I'm really unhappy because all the good names are taken. The Axis is taken. Okay, those are the bad guys who beat us. Well, we beat in World War II. Ooh, even the Axis of Evil is taken. And the one I would have named it Chump, which is the guys who fought Lancelot Link's secret chimp all those years ago. That's the evil Baron who fought against Lancelot Link. All the good names are taken for the things that caused our military defeat in Vietnam. So I had to come up with a new name. It's called the Quadrilateral of Doom. This is what caused our defeat in Vietnam. And these are, if there's 4 things to blame, here they are. A, commies. And this is like grandfather commie, not great-grandfather, that would have been Marx, but this is grandfather commie. Golly, what are we doing there? A motive force that's hard to fight against, the living embodiment of communism in North Vietnam, who's going to be Ho Chi Minh. Okay, communism on one side. Who's that? Any guesses? My class ought to know who that guy is. That's Ngo Dinh Diem, the dictatorial leader of South Vietnam during its early part of its history. Here's the second part of the Quadrilateral of Doom. We backed the wrong damn Vietnamese. We backed the wimpy ones. We didn't back the guys who, you know, dig tunnels and fight from them. We backed the guys who were full of graft, didn't try very hard, and caved in pretty quickly. So that's the other part of the Quadrilateral of Doom. Next one. These guys. That's morally safer. He's like asking a Vietnamese villager, how do you feel about your house getting burned down around you? The media. That's another part of the Quadrilateral of Doom, isn't it? The media is another thing that cost us Vietnam. But my favorite one, hippies. Hippies caused the loss of the war. And I had to go further with hippies. They're long-haired, dope-smoking hippies with their free love. I had better pictures of free love, but I couldn't put them up here. And that's kind of actually free flute playing. It's not actually free love. And with their devil music, you got to admit that's a pretty good picture of devil music. Okay, let's get back to all these, all those things. You know, long-haired hippies. It's the counterculture. There's no doubt about that. And of course, they're into illicit drugs. And by the way, if you're really counting up anti-war people, hippies are the last ones you're going to count. Because of this, they're too busy smoking dope to be against the war. They're too busy doing things like, you know, they're being hippies. And are those guys hippies? I mean, this guy kind of looks like Charles Manson a little bit. But look, the rest of them have short hair. A lot of the people who are against the war tended to not be your prototypical hippies. Well, these guys are, but these guys ain't against nothing. They're for something. I'm not sure what it is, but they're for something. And you know, Jimi Hendrix was, you know, he has a couple of good songs that deal with the war in some meaningful way, but he really wasn't an anti-war figure. But let's look at each one of these very blameworthy individuals, if you're, you know, prone to that kind of thing. Let's look at them in order. Let's look at the South Vietnamese. And here we have some pretty famous pictures of South Vietnam. There's Ngo Dinh Diem again. Here on, golly, what is that? That's your right, isn't it? This is the evacuation of Da Nang. It's one of the last flights to leave Da Nang in 1975. Pretty famous picture. I would love to know what happened to this guy. I mean, that looks like a pretty rough position to be in, right? And when your face beat in as you tried to, and as we're about to see, what these guys are fleeing is something that's pretty terrible. So I can see why he wanted to get on that plane. And perhaps the iconic image of the South Vietnamese, if you have any image, the other iconic image will come up later, I promise. This is General Nguyen Ngoc Loan, the head of the South Vietnamese police, summarily executing a guy during the Tet Offensive. The story behind the picture is, you know, that guy was a VC operative. There's no doubt about that. By the way, VC operatives who infiltrated Saigon, they didn't dress like soldiers, did they? Or they wouldn't have infiltrated Saigon. Chances are this guy deserved a military court and a military trial. He didn't get one. But chances are, had he had that military court and military trial, he would have been treated about the same way. But of course, this picture rages across the United States and has a big impact on how we're going to look at the war. So again, what's the image of South Vietnam in this war? Corrupt, doomed to failure, doomed from the outset. This is the one where I'm on the surest historiographical ground, because a lot of the points I made in my own book, so I can't tell you too much about it. Go out and buy the book. And I could wander on for hours about this. But what I'm trying to do is deal with this in a pretty short kind of way. The South Vietnamese, I argue in my book, actually had, in many ways, a chance to survive. Certainly, there were big problems. There was graft. There was a lack of nationalism. There were so many political parties that it's a bewildering political array in South Vietnam. So many religions. I mean, you name it. Creating a nation there was going to be difficult, no doubt. But was it going to be impossible? The answer to that is no. As we'll talk later when we get to the communists, were the communists the odds-on favorite to win in South Vietnam? Actually, the odds are there no too, because their reach was much deeper in North Vietnam. The Viet Minh had never been in that great a control of South Vietnam. South Vietnam was always more cosmopolitan, always different. If you look at the big histories that say the South Vietnamese were just doomed to failure, their history is largely written by Americans who know very little about Vietnamese history. I mean, they look at it through the eyes of either the Orthodox or revisionist viewpoint, and they've taken their cues before they even begin. My argument is South Vietnam had problems, certainly. Had flaws, had graft, had desertion, poor leadership skills, you name it. South Vietnam had some bad problems, and a very over-politicized military. If you add those problems had synergy with our problems, a synergy that got everything out of whack. What were we doing there? Arguably, as we'll discuss later, we were fighting the wrong war. Arguably, we were fighting the wrong way, and arguably we took the South Vietnamese and set them aside in a war that should have been theirs to win. Okay? So my argument here is we weren't fated to defeat, neither were they, but the sum total of our mistakes just really added up to something bigger than it probably could have been to begin with. If we'd have fought a wiser war there, i.e. a war that more included them, a more alliance war rather than a shove them out of the way war, I think that was probably the way to go. Would it have been fated to win? Don't know. Again, that's anti-historical, isn't it? Would it have been easy? No way. Nation building in a country that doesn't want to be built, at least from the beginning, is not easy. But let me give you just some numbers here. And again, I could talk about this for a long time. South Vietnam fought for every day that it was South Vietnam from 1954 to 1975. 21 years, unless my mathematical skills, which are pretty weak, are off. South Vietnam fought every day of its history. And that's the simple point that they didn't fight, that they didn't help us, that we backed the wrong Vietnamese is just too simple. South Vietnam lost 200,000 battle deaths in its military during those 20 years. That's a lot. I mean, America loses, what, 400,000 plus in World War II. Okay? But let's look at the South Vietnamese population. If you consider their battle losses versus their population, if you compare that to the American population, that would have been like us losing 8 million battlefield casualties. Battlefield deaths, not casualties. So 20 years, 8 million deaths, if you look at our numbers. And by the way, the South Vietnamese lost 1 million civilian casualties. Both caused by them, caused by us, caused by the Viet Cong, caused by the North. There's lots of people killing South Vietnamese, isn't there? South Vietnam was ravaged. After the war was over, there were arguably about 300,000 of them thrown in jail for years and years in so-called re-education camps. And by the way, that's not indicative of a nation that wants to be easily taken over, right? And at least 2 million of them flee as boat people. Many of them wind up here. The point there is, these guys were not a nation who didn't fight. These guys put up a stauncher defense than, golly, have we ever asked this of ourselves? A 21 long year war that kills 8 million people? No. So just to stand back and say, it was their fault, we backed the wrong guys, way too simple. In fact, my argument is, that government there was much more capable of survival than the two governments we're supporting now in Iraq and Afghanistan, by far. But we didn't fight a war well alongside them. So, one axis of the quadrilateral of doom, just a little more complicated than most historians bring it out to be. It's a different story than they were bad, okay? Second label of the quadrilateral of doom, various and assorted commies. Here we have Lenin, godfather of them all. Don't forget Mao. Man, lots of support from China in this war. Of course, maybe I should have Khrushchev or somebody else like that for the Russians, but I had to limit myself to one Ruski. There's a North Vietnamese soldier about to kill the pitiful South Vietnamese in battle. There's Uncle Ho Chi Minh, and here's Ngo Nguyen Giap, the commander, first of the Viet Minh, and then later of the North Vietnamese, and arguably the Viet Cong as well. The line here is that these guys were unbeatable. You know, unlike South Vietnam, which didn't have a chance, these guys were unbeatable. Come on. What were they as far as Americans are concerned? They were the inheritors of a 1,000-year-long struggle against China. And then the inheritors of a 100-year-long struggle against France. These guys are used to facing hopeless odds against gigantic world powers. Us, in a 25-year-long war, come on, they're going to beat us, aren't they? So you got to tip your hat to the bad guys on the other side. These guys were good bad guys. And if you read many American histories, these guys were essentially fated to win. No doubt about it. Which is, you're going to see that in a war you lose. The other side was great, and that's why we lost. Again, it's a little more complicated than that. They were very hard fighters, very tenacious, very, very difficult to deal with, but were they fated to win? No. Again, the people who said they're fated to win are largely Americans who don't understand Vietnamese history. And I'll grant you, I'm not the greatest Vietnamese historical scholar, but I've read enough to understand that it's just more complicated than that. The communist form of nationalism in Vietnam is one form of nationalism. There's lots of others, especially verdant in South Vietnam, the country that we inherited. By the way, who is telling the world that the Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese, him are the inheritors, the only inheritors of true Vietnamese nationalism? Who's telling the world that? They are. I mean, the victors write the history, and in this case they did a really good job of it, painting themselves as the only possible answer in Vietnam. And guess what? It's just not that simple. If you look at Vietnamese history a little more in depth, it's a lot more complicated than that. There's a lot of North-South struggle. There's a lot of internationalist group struggle. It's not just as simple as the South Vietnamese are bad, North Vietnamese are good, and that's why the war should end the way it is. Another strain of argument along this side is that this guy was a genius. Of course we can't beat a genius. It's like fighting Napoleon. Well, Napoleon lost. It's like fighting Rommel. No, Rommel lost. Figure out some genius that won. It's like fighting a genius. General Vo Nguyen Giap. Let's throw this out the window too. He makes 3 of the most catastrophic mistakes in military history. He stands up and gets his army pasted against the French in 1951, gets the Viet Cong destroyed against us in 1968, and gets the North Vietnamese army destroyed against the South Vietnamese in the Eastern Offensive in 1972. This guy makes enough huge mistakes to get fired in most militaries. Okay, so it's not like we're facing infallible people on the other side either. These guys are very capable of making mistakes that we perhaps could take advantage of. Last but not least, I think the most legs this one has, that the communists are destined to win, come from here. Come from the Soviet Union and China. And I don't want to be too denigratory. Is that even a word? Dr. Justice would know if that's a word or not. Denigrating of. I don't want to be too denigrating of the American effort in Vietnam. But if you look at it, and I'm going to throw a scary thing out there, perhaps the North Vietnamese had the more stalwart ally. I mean, granted, the Soviets and Chinese never, partly because the North Vietnamese don't want them to, get their ground troops involved. So they don't lose 58,000 men like we do. But we're out of there in 1973. They're still there. Perhaps the North Vietnamese have the strong ally, and South Vietnam actually doesn't, even though we fight the war in a more forceful kind of way. So the communists, look at them. Perhaps it's not as simple as they were great and destined to win. Oh, golly, let's get to the media, shall we? There's Morley Safer at the Battle of Cam Nay, one of the first Zippo raids by American troops burning down a village. And of course he's saying, and by the way, people, I mean, ask this poor, is that a woman or a man? I can't tell, kind of hard to tell. It's like, ask this poor Vietnamese androgynous person whether or not they like their building being burned down. No, they don't. Okay. Over here is, over here is two of the more famous reporters in the war, David Halberstam and Neil Sheehan, who were the biggest reporters as the war was getting started, and become very famous writing wars about it later. This is Seymour Hersh, the guy who dumps My Lai, who gets the story of My Lai out in 1969, and this is of course one of the other iconic image of the war, the young girl fleeing the napalm attack. I think it's in 70 or 71. The idea being here is that we had everything going good until the media turned the public against us, us being the entire country and the military. There's no doubt, reporters were everywhere across Vietnam. I mean, it is a living room war, although it's a little different. It wasn't instantaneous reporting. You didn't have a battle on TV that night. It had to go through Japan and make it to, reporting wasn't quite as quick. But if you look at the first big battle of the Vietnam War, the Battle of the Ia Drang Valley, right beside the commander, a guy named Hal Moore, is Joe Galloway, a reporter at that point in time for the Times, I believe. I can't remember what he was reporting for. But for every battle, there was a reporter there. And of course, we always get into the argument at this point, where is the place of a free media in a free country in times of war? It's one of the corner pieces of a free society to have a free media, but it's also one of the corner pieces of war to have secrecy. So where do we play in? And arguably, certainly one of the points about the Vietnam War is that the media was too free and turned the country against the war. Again, I think this is perhaps a little simplistic. The best book I can think of it is by a guy named Daniel Hallen called The Uncensored War, the Media in Vietnam. And it gets into, part of it is a simple counting up of the stories that came out about Vietnam, and were they pro-Vietnam War stories or anti-Vietnam War stories. And the pro-Vietnam War stories vastly outnumber the anti-war stories. What he finds out is most reporting in Vietnam is the same kind of reporting you get in World War II. American soldiers off doing battles, and and perhaps your son's off there, so he's he has a Vietnamese girlfriend, so let's report on that. Human interest and things like that. But of course, after the Tet Offensive, after '68, there is certainly an edge to the reporting. But his point is going to be, and it certainly is, that even when the edge comes to the reporting, that is still not an overwhelming edge. That there are still pro-American stories coming out, stories. His general point is, and I tend to think this is pretty accurate, that the American media did not lead public opinion in this war. It reported on public opinion. There was great divisiveness in this country. There was great divisiveness in our troops. And without that kind of stuff to report, these guys wouldn't have been reporting. Granted, there was some sensationalism going on. Some of them actually thought they were trying to lead the public, but I think they did a fairly ineffective job if they tried to lead it. I think the two constituencies that love to say, and I know I've got a clock up here somewhere. There's a clock up there. The two constituencies that love to say the media caused the end of this war, there's two of them. One's the military. Once the military says we won, but the media cost us. Who's the other constituency that says the media caused this war to end the way that it did? The media. Because they like to see themselves as the fourth estate, the guardian of American liberty. They portray what they did in Vietnam as a great thing, while the military portrays it as a dastardly thing. In my view, the media is one ingredient in the big pot of gumbo that is defeat in Vietnam. It perhaps isn't the dominant one, but it is certainly one. Okay? Let's get down to hippies. Everybody's favorite. And I'm sorry, Curtis, I'm including civil rights in hippies, because what I mean by hippies is the entirety of all the social trouble that's going on in the '60s. I mean, just too many Americans say, "Ooh, hippies are happening in the '60s." It's the counterculture. It's women's rights. It's civil rights. I mean, the '60s are going to be torn apart by these 3, 4 gigantic things. And don't forget the huge demographic bubble that is the baby boom. I mean, you name it. The '60s is going to be messed up with or without Vietnam, socially and culturally. I mean, it's going to have cool music. It's going to have fire hoses getting squirted on people and dogs. And the '60s is going to be that way. And that certainly interacts with Vietnam. And some people would certainly contend in a fated way and in a fatal way. Let's look at this basically from the military standpoint.